Good day. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about K-12 online learning and the role that teacher education has to play in this age of disruption that we live in. I'm Michael Barbour, a professor of instructional design at Touro University, California. I became interested in K-12 distance and online learning as an undergraduate student in the late 1990s, as the program I was in had a federal grant to create online advanced placement science and mathematics courses for students attending rural schools. As fortune would have it, my first job as a teacher was in the home district for this program, and being a social studies teacher, I wanted to level the playing field. So I secured some additional federal funding to create an online program that eventually offered all 6 AP Social Studies courses. Over the past 3 decades, my interest and involvement in K-12 distance, online, and blended learning has just continued to expand. It is easy to think of online learning in the K-12 context solely through the lens of the recent COVID-19 pandemic and the worldwide school closures. So, to begin, I want to provide the viewer with some context about the state of K-12 distance and online learning prior to the pandemic. The first thing that's important to remember is that K-12 distance education, in one shape or another, has been around for well over a century. Depending on the jurisdiction, in most cases, it has taken a predictable evolution as the technology has improved. For example, most K-12 distance learning began in the early 1900s as correspondence programs. In the 1920s and 30s, that migrated to various forms of educational radio, followed by instructional television in the 1960s, then audiographic systems in the 1980s. In the early 1990s, K-12 education began experimenting with online learning. The first recorded online school in the United States was a private school in California in 1991. This was followed by a variety of supplemental and full-time online programs. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, federal and state grants were driving the creation of statewide supplemental programs, while charter school legislation was driving the establishment of full-time online schools. The first Keeping Pace with K-12 Online Learning reports began in 2003, which provided an accounting of the nature and level of activity on a state-by-state basis. This kind of national study was replicated internationally in 2009 as the State of the Nation K-12 Online Learning in Canada was published. By the end of the first decade of the new millennium, there were more than 1.5 million K-12 students in the United States that had taken one or more courses online. According to the last Keeping Pace report, released before the pandemic, which had been rebranded as the Snapshot series, indicated that 32 states allowed statewide online schools, and there was an estimated 310,000 students enrolled in these schools. At the same time, there were statewide supplemental schools in 23 states that were serving approximately 420,000 students with almost 1 million enrollments. This was in addition to countless numbers of school districts that managed their own online programs, all of whom likely enrolled hundreds of thousands, even millions of additional students in online learning. Then, of course, the pandemic hit. Following widespread school closures, teachers were left scrambling to find ways to provide continuity of learning. So we went from this kind of distance learning before transitioning to the ever-popular Zoom school that followed it. Even as departments of education and school districts had opportunities to plan for more purposeful implementation of remote learning, the vast majority of educators were still unprepared for what was being asked of them. As you might imagine, poorly designed remote learning coupled with unprepared teachers led to poor experiences for students. Essentially, the problem became that schools could not get past their Phase 2 response to COVID. Teachers did an admirable job during Phase 1, attempting to implement whatever solutions they were capable of undertaking. As the next school year began, schools began to implement planned temporary measures, but they were never really able to reach a stage where a student could be in the school on a Friday afternoon when an announcement came over the PA system telling them that school would be transitioning to remote learning on Monday morning, and there'd be no loss of instructional integrity or continuity of learning when that switch occurred. One of the major impediments to the implementation of remote learning was the fact that teachers were simply unprepared to teach when some or all of their students were at a distance. This shouldn't have been surprising, given the fact that research has shown that the vast majority of teacher education programs simply do not provide any focused content or opportunities for pre-service teachers to experience online learning. Prior to the pandemic, Even the universities that did provide some materials related to K-12 online learning typically did so at the graduate level for in-service teachers. In fact, even those teachers who worked for online programs generally reported that they did not receive any professional development on how to teach online prior to being asked to teach in an online school. It was based upon these realities that Chuck Hodges, Rick Ferdig, and I responded to a call for papers by the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education in 2022 that asked for specific actions that teacher education programs could undertake by the year 2025 in order to ensure that teachers were ready for the kind of situations that we saw with COVID-19. Over the past 3 years, Chuck Hodges and I have continued to develop and refine recommendations through additional articles and book chapters that explored what teachers could do themselves, the research basis for these recommendations from a domestic and international perspective, as well as 2 decades of warning from U.S. federal government on how schools needed to be ready for exactly what occurred in 2022. And what we knew from historical examples when distance learning to provide continuity of learning in other crises was implemented. The first recommendation is that there needs to be validated research-based standards for the design, delivery, and support of K-12 online learning developed. The reality is, while there are numerous sets of standards currently available for use, none of those that have been released in the past 2 decades have been validated through a systematic research process. Second, a lack of research-based standards or any empirically determined best practices means that there are no valid instruments in which to judge good and bad K-12 online course content or K-12 online teaching. Third, specific content focused upon K-12 online learning needs to be integrated throughout pre-service teacher education programs in a program-wide, program-deep philosophy. This cannot be done as a standalone course that separates K-12 online learning or through a claimed infusion throughout the program that rarely happens because the teacher education faculty themselves are often ill-equipped to accomplish the task. Fourth, pre-service teachers need to experience online learning themselves. This means that some of their teacher education courses or significant components within those courses need to be delivered online. Fifth, in the same way that pre-service teachers learn to implement didactic components of their curriculum through student teaching, the same is true of online learning curriculum contained in the teacher education programs. Finally, as we all know, unless accrediting bodies or state agencies require teacher education programs to include these components in their pre-service teacher education, universities will continue to fall back upon the realistic complaint that their curriculum is already too full with other such requirements. We feel that these 6 recommendations are all things that could be implemented today, and the first 5 are actions that teacher education programs could implement without being required to do so. And it is something that all universities should strongly consider, because the school closures that we saw due to COVID-19 aren't going to be a single-time event. While not necessarily global in scale, just in the past couple of decades, we've seen regional school closures due to SARS and H1N1, including in North America. One only needs to look to the past century to find several examples of school closures in the United States due to Spanish flu or polio outbreaks. And it is also important to remember that global pandemics and regional epidemics have been becoming more frequent than what we have seen throughout history. So the likelihood that a teacher beginning their career now will see another school closure due to a pandemic outbreak is high. Even if we assume COVID-19 was a once-in-a-generation event, only in the last couple of years, we've seen schools need to close for short-term, in some cases long-term periods, due to increasingly severe weather events or natural disasters. I look to my own home province of Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, where a month before the COVID-19 shutdown, all of the schools in the capital region were closed for 2 weeks because of a severe snowstorm. Even if we assume that teachers will never be asked to undertake remote learning because of a pandemic or epidemic, severe weather event, or natural disaster, the reality is that online learning in both the supplemental and full-time manner has grown significantly over the past 5 years, as illustrated in the most recent snapshot report. Even if we exclude all of the students that shifted to an online format during the 2020-21 school year or the 2021-22 school year for safety reasons, the reality is the data from the 2022-23 school year is still well above the natural growth that has been occurring in the field prior to the pandemic. And this growth will only increase which means teachers will need to know how to design, deliver, and/or support online learning for their students. Hopefully, this sets the stage for some of the additional presentations that will round out this series. Thank you for your time.